Orthopedic surgeons will tell you the pillow debate is about comfort. Chiropractors will hand you a buying guide. The sleep industry will sell you 17 different foam densities and call it biomechanics. And somewhere in that noise, the actual physics of what happens to the cervical spine during 6 to 8 hours of gravitational loading in a horizontally recumbent position gets completely lost. Because the moment you treat the pillow question as a comfort question, you have already made the wrong assumption. The pillow is not a comfort device. It is a mechanical spacer whose presence or absence determines the angular geometry of the cervical column during the single longest sustained postural position the human body assumes every day. And that geometry, held for 6 to 8 hours, drives molecular consequences inside the intervertebral disc that the laws of fluid mechanics and osmotic thermodynamics make completely unavoidable. The question is not whether you sleep better with or without one. The question is what the compressive and tensile load distribution across the annulus fibrosus looks like at 2 in the morning, and whether the nucleus pulposus inside each cervical disc is hydrating or dehydrating based on that geometry, because those two outcomes are not equivalent and they are not reversible on the same timescale. Now, look, let's build this from the disc itself, because the intervertebral disc is the structure carrying the entire mechanical and biological consequence of this decision. And most people have a deeply inadequate mental model of what it actually is. The intervertebral disc is not a cushion in any passive sense. It is a pressurized hydrogel system operating under continuous osmotic and mechanical stress. The nucleus pulposus, at its core, is composed primarily of type 2 collagen, aggrecan, a proteoglycan with an extraordinarily high fixed negative charge density, and water, which comprises roughly 70 to 90% of its volume in a healthy young disc. The aggrecan molecules carry sulfated glycosaminoglycan chains that are densely negatively charged. These charges attract cations, sodium, calcium, from the surrounding interstitial fluid through Donin equilibrium, generating a local osmotic pressure inside the nucleus that can reach several atmospheres under appropriate hydration conditions. This osmotic pressure is what resists compressive load. It is what allows the disc to act as a hydraulic shock absorber. It is the physical mechanism by which the disc maintains disc height and distributes compressive force uniformly across the vertebral end plates, rather than concentrating it in stress risers that damage the underlying bone. The disc has no direct blood supply. Let me put that on the board clearly because it is the central thermodynamic fact governing everything else. The intervertebral disc is the largest avascular structure in the human body. Its cells, the nucleus pulposus cells and the annular fibrocytes, receive oxygen and glucose exclusively through diffusion from the capillary beds in the vertebral end plates and the outer annulus. Diffusion, not perfusion. Slow, passive, gradient-driven transport that covers distances of several millimeters through a dense extracellular matrix. The diffusion distance from the nearest capillary to the center of a lumbar disc can exceed 6 to 8 millimeters, and the diffusion coefficient of oxygen through the nucleus is low enough that the oxygen tension at the disc center is already near anaerobic thresholds under normal conditions. The cells of the nucleus pulposus are running their metabolism at the edge of hypoxia every hour of every day. This is not a flaw in the design. It is a consequence of the mechanical requirement that the disc be able to sustain enormous compressive loads without being riddled with blood vessels that would rupture under that load. The design trades metabolic access for mechanical robustness. The consequence of this avascularity is that disc cell nutrition depends critically on convective fluid movement through the disc matrix, the cyclical compression and decompression driven by loading and unloading during movement and postural change. When you stand, axial load compresses the disc, fluid moves outward through the matrix and the end plate. When you lie down, compressive load drops, osmotic pressure draws fluid back in, and with it, glucose and oxygen. This is the disc's nutrient delivery system, not a blood vessel, a squeeze and release hydrogel pump driven by the physics of osmotic rehydration during periods of reduced mechanical loading. Sleep is the primary rehydration event for the intervertebral disc. 8 hours of recumbent position with dramatically reduced axial compressive load allows the osmotic pressure of the nucleus to drive fluid back in through the end plates. This is why humans are measurably taller in the morning by approximately 1 to 2 centimeters than in the evening. The discs have rehydrated overnight. They have rebuilt their osmotic reserve. The nucleus pulposus has recovered the water content required to generate the hydraulic pressure that resists the next day's compressive loading. If you measure disc height on MRI in the morning versus the evening, the difference is visually apparent. The disc is a different structure at 6 in the morning than it is at 11 at night, and the quality of that overnight rehydration determines its mechanical competence for the following day. Now let's follow that molecular logic to the chalkboard, because the geometry of the cervical spine during sleep is not neutral with respect to this rehydration process. It is a controlling variable. And this is where removing the pillow becomes a question of applied fluid mechanics rather than personal preference. The cervical spine has a natural lordotic curve, a gentle anterior convexity, meaning the spine curves forward when viewed from the side. This curve exists because the intervertebral discs in the cervical region are slightly wedge-shaped, thicker anteriorly than posteriorly, and because the surrounding musculature and ligamentous tension are calibrated to maintain this curvature under normal upright posture. The functional consequence of the lordotic curve is that compressive load is distributed relatively uniformly across the disc surface. Neither the anterior nor the posterior annulus is bearing disproportionate load, and the nucleus pulposus sits centered within the disc space, contained by balanced annular tension on all sides. Now remove the pillow. A person sleeping on their back without a pillow has their head resting flat on the mattress surface. In this position, the cervical spine is forced into a relative extension. The head drops back, the anterior neck opens, the posterior elements of the cervical vertebrae approximate. The cervical lordosis is exaggerated beyond its neutral angle. In extension, the posterior annulus fibrosus is under increased compressive load, while the anterior disc space widens. The nucleus pulposus is driven posteriorly within the disc by the asymmetric pressure gradient created by this geometry. Maintained for 6 to 8 hours, this is not a trivial positional asymmetry. It is a sustained asymmetric mechanical load applied to the disc during the period when the disc is simultaneously attempting to rehydrate through osmotic fluid uptake. Here is the problem at the level of disc physics. Rehydration through the end plate is not isotropic. It does not occur equally across the entire disc surface simultaneously. Fluid moves in along osmotic gradients from regions of lower mechanical stress toward the nucleus. In a disc under asymmetric posterior compression, the fluid movement pathway is partially obstructed on the compressed side. The end plate vasculature on the posteriorly loaded side is under compressive stress that reduces its permeability. The rehydration is geometrically biased. The nucleus does not rehydrate uniformly. Over months and years, this asymmetric loading pattern during sleep, the disc's primary rehydration window, produces predictable structural consequences: asymmetric disc height loss, altered nucleus position, and differential stress on the annular fiber layers that are already the site of the earliest disc pathology. The annulus fibrosus is worth examining precisely here because it is where the structural damage accumulates. The annulus is composed of 15 to 25 concentric lamellae of type 1 collagen fibers. Within each lamella, the fibers run at approximately 65 degrees to the disk axis, alternating direction between adjacent lamellae. This geometry, analogous to a radial tire, gives the annulus its ability to resist both compressive and torsional loads. The fiber architecture is the load-bearing structure, and it is entirely dependent on the nucleus maintaining its central, pressurized position to keep the annular lamellae under appropriate tension. When the nucleus migrates posteriorly under sustained extension loading, the posterior annular fibers are subjected to altered tension. The inner lamellae buckle slightly as the nucleus pushes against them from the inside, while simultaneously the posterior disc height reduction under extension compresses the outer lamellae. This combination of inner tensile and outer compressive stress on the posterior annulus is precisely the mechanical environment in which annular fissuring initiates. The fissures begin between lamellae and propagate radially outward over time. They are not immediately painful. They are structural failures in a collagen architecture that does not repair itself efficiently because the disc has no blood supply. Now, it gets more depressing when you consider the cell biology running inside this stressed tissue. The nucleus pulposus cells, chondrocyte-like cells responsible for maintaining the extracellular matrix, are mechanosensitive. They respond to their mechanical environment through integrin-mediated signaling, cytoskeletal tension, and mechanically activated ion channels. Under normal, cyclically varying compressive load, they maintain a balanced anabolic-catabolic program, synthesizing aggrecan and type 2 collagen to replace what is naturally degraded. Under sustained, asymmetric, or excessive compressive load, this balance shifts. The cells upregulate matrix metalloproteinases, enzymes that degrade collagen and proteoglycans and reduce synthesis of aggrecan. The osmotic pressure of the nucleus drops as aggrecan is degraded and not replaced. The nucleus dehydrates progressively, not just because of mechanical load, but because the cells responsible for maintaining its chemical composition are responding to mechanical stress signals by dismantling it. The point is actually quite subtle here, and it is where the pillow question stops being a biomechanics question and becomes an information systems question. The nucleus pulposus cells are running a continuous quality control program on the extracellular matrix they inhabit. They sample the mechanical and chemical state of their environment through membrane receptors, transduce those signals through intracellular kinase cascades, and regulate gene expression accordingly. This is the disk's biological data processing system, and like any signal processing system, its output fidelity depends on the quality of the input signal it receives. A nucleus pulposus cell, sitting in a properly hydrated, uniformly pressurized disk under balanced annular tension, receives a mechanical signal that falls within the normal physiological range. It reads that signal correctly and maintains its anabolic program. A nucleus pulposus cell, sitting in a dehydrated, eccentrically loaded nucleus under sustained asymmetric annular stress during the very window when matrix synthesis rates should be highest, because disk cell metabolism follows a circadian rhythm that peaks during sleep, receives a signal that reads as pathological load. It responds accordingly. It upregulates catabolic enzymes. It reduces matrix synthesis. The data corruption from 6 to 8 hours of aberrant mechanical input propagates through the intracellular signaling network and emerges as altered gene expression that accelerates matrix degradation. Over years, this is the molecular pathway from sleeping without a pillow to accelerated cervical disc degeneration. Not through any single catastrophic event, through the quiet, nightly accumulation of mechanically corrupted signals in cells that are trying to maintain a biological structure using the best information they have access to, and receiving bad data every night during the period they are most actively trying to respond to it. Now, the side sleeping case is even more mechanically stark because the geometry is more extreme. A person sleeping on their side without a pillow has their head dropped laterally toward the mattress. The cervical spine is in sustained lateral flexion, with the shoulder girdle acting as a fixed platform that the unsupported head drops away from. The lateral tilt angle of the cervical spine in this configuration, depending on shoulder width, can range from 15 to 35 degrees from neutral. Every intervertebral disc in the cervical column is now under asymmetric lateral loading, compressed on the mattress side, under tensile stress on the ceiling side. The nucleus is driven laterally toward the compressed side. The lateral annular fibers on the compressed side are under combined compressive and shear stress. The lateral annular fibers on the opposite side are under tensile loading that, sustained for hours, exceeds the normal physiological range for the posterior and lateral annular lamellae. Let me sketch this on the board. Here is C5 to C6 under lateral loading. The nucleus is here, pushed toward the right annulus. The right lateral annular lamellae are buckled and compressed. The left lateral lamellae are under sustained tensile load. The end plate on the right side, under compressive stress, has reduced permeability. The fluid rehydration this disc should be performing is happening through an asymmetric, partially obstructed pathway. Over 8 hours, the nucleus rehydrates unevenly, gains less volume than it would on the neutral geometry, and the cells on the compressed side are receiving sustained compressive mechanical signals that will drive their catabolic program. The cells on the tensile side are receiving sustained tensile signals that, above a threshold, are equally degenerative. Both populations of cells are in mechanically aberrant territory. Both are getting bad data. Both are responding in ways that accelerate matrix breakdown. The appropriate use of a pillow in this context is not about comfort. It is about maintaining the neutral cervical geometry that allows the disc to rehydrate symmetrically, that keeps annular fiber tension balanced, that positions the nucleus centrally so that end plate permeability is approximately equal across the disc surface, and that delivers to the nucleus pulposus cells a mechanical signal within the physiological range that their regulatory program is calibrated to interpret as normal. For back sleeping, the pillow fills the space between the posterior skull and the mattress surface, preventing cervical extension and maintaining the natural lordotic angle. For side sleeping, the pillow fills the space between the ear and the shoulder, preventing lateral cervical flexion and maintaining the cervical spine in the horizontal neutral plane. The height and compliance properties of the pillow matter. A pillow that is too high pushes the cervical spine into flexion, which has its own set of annular loading consequences. And a pillow that is too firm distributes contact pressure unevenly across the skull and cervical musculature. But these are second-order considerations. The first-order consideration is whether the cervical spine is in or near neutral geometry during the disc's primary rehydration window. The presence of an appropriately sized pillow is the single most accessible intervention for ensuring that it is. The cervical musculature adds another layer to this picture that is worth addressing directly. The posterior cervical muscles, semispinalis cervicis, multifidus, suboccipital muscles, are under continuous eccentric tension when the head is not supported in neutral alignment. Muscle tissue held in sustained eccentric contraction generates heat, consumes ATP, and accumulates metabolic waste, lactate, hydrogen ions, inorganic phosphate in the local interstitial space. The microvascular supply to muscles under sustained tension is compressed, reducing clearance of these metabolites. The result is the accumulated morning stiffness, the occipital headache, the restricted rotation range of motion that people who sleep without pillows or with incorrect pillow geometry report with remarkable consistency. These are not minor nuisances. They are the surface readout of a deeper process, sustained metabolic waste accumulation in tissues whose clearance depends on the same microvascular supply that is being compressed by the mechanical tension required to stabilize an unsupported head. The downstream signaling consequences of this sustained cervical muscle activation are also not trivial. Chronically elevated cervical muscle tension activates local inflammatory pathways, substance P, cytokine release from muscle cells under mechanical stress, that sensitize the sensory afferents running through the cervical region. These afferents include the branches of the trigeminal nucleus that extend into the upper cervical spinal cord. Sensitization of this system is a well-established mechanism in cervicogenic headache and in certain patterns of referred pain into the shoulder and upper extremity. The information degradation here is not metaphorical. It is a literal lowering of the activation threshold of sensory neurons, a shift in the signal-to-noise ratio of the pain detection system that makes the nervous system more likely to interpret normal mechanical inputs as painful because the background noise floor has been raised by sustained inflammatory sensitization of the cervical sensory afferents overnight. There is a version of this argument that people sometimes push back against by pointing to populations, certain traditional societies, in which people sleep on hard surfaces with minimal or no pillow support and apparently do not develop epidemic cervical disc disease. The point is actually quite subtle here, and it requires distinguishing between postural loading during sleep and postural loading throughout the entire day. People in traditional agricultural or hunter-gatherer contexts are not sitting at desks for 8 hours with their heads forward flexed over a screen, accumulating anterior cervical disc stress and posterior ligamentous creep before they lie down. The cervical spine they bring to their sleeping position has not been preloaded with hours of sustained, non-neutral geometry. The disc they are asking to rehydrate overnight has not spent the day in the mechanically compromised state that modern sedentary work patterns produce. The two situations are not analogous, and drawing conclusions from one to apply to the other requires ignoring the cumulative mechanical history that the disc cells are integrating over the entire 24-hour cycle. What is operating here underneath the pillow debate, underneath the comfort language and the sleep product marketing is a biological machine making decisions about tissue maintenance based on the mechanical inputs it receives during the one extended period every day when it has the metabolic and osmotic conditions to do repair work. The nucleus pulposus cells have a circadian program. They express matrix synthesis genes at higher levels during the rest phase. The disk's osmotic machinery is primed to rehydrate during unloading. The biological system is prepared and ready to do maintenance, but the quality of that maintenance, the fidelity of the matrix it rebuilds, the accuracy of the molecular signals that guide the cell's anabolic versus catabolic balance, all of it depends on the mechanical geometry of the cervical column during those hours. The laws of thermodynamics governing osmotic fluid transport, the laws of fluid mechanics governing nuclear pressure distribution, the laws of molecular biology governing mechanosensitive cell signaling, none of these negotiate. They operate on the cervical disc the same way every night, regardless of what anyone believes about pillows or sleeps, and they produce outcomes that reflect the geometry they were given to work with. A spine held in neutral geometry during its rehydration window gets better maintenance than a spine held in extension or lateral flexion. The cells receive better signals. The matrix rebuilds more completely. The annular stress concentrations are lower. The long-run structural integrity of the cervical disc is better preserved. This is what it means to operate a biological machine under the uncompromising jurisdiction of physical law. The machine does not take positions on lifestyle choices. It processes the inputs it receives and produces outputs dictated by the equations of osmotic thermodynamics, fluid mechanics, and mechanobiology. The question of whether to use a pillow is, at its physical core, the question of whether you are giving the most structurally loaded and least vascularized tissue in your axial skeleton the geometric conditions it requires to perform the one maintenance operation it gets each day. The window is 8 hours. It opens every night. What the disc does with it depends entirely on the angle of the spine it is embedded in. The physics doesn't care about your preference. It only cares about the geometry.